Okay, welcome everyone. I'm seeing some people gradually enter the webinar. So welcome. This is the Expanding Empathy 2021 series. Glad you could make it. As more folks enter the room, just to give you a sense of where you are, this is the third year we've been running this series through the Rock Ethics Institute. I host it through the Moral Agency and Moral Development Initiative through the College of Liberal Arts. It is my pleasure to introduce Adam, who is Dr. Waytz, who's the first of 6 speakers this year who will be talking today about humans and machines. Let me give you a brief background biography of Adam. He is the Morris and Alice Kaplan Chair in Ethics and Decision Making and Professor of Management Organizations. His research uses methods from social psychology and cognitive neuroscience to study the causes and consequences of perceiving mental states in other agents and to investigate processes related to social influence, social connection, meaning making, and ethics. He has published in a lot of the top journals in social psychology and psychology more generally, like Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. He's received numerous awards. He won the Theoretical Innovation Prize from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology twice, in 2008 and 2013, the Sage Foundation Young Scholar Award, and the International Social Cognition Network's Early Career Award. He was also a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation from 2018 to 2019, and a lot of accolades, very impressive. He received his NSRA from the NIH to do a postdoc at Harvard after getting his PhD at the University of Chicago. I've known Dr. Waytz for many years. I remember back when I was a grad student, he came and gave a talk. It was wonderful and really inspiring. And I think his topic will speak to a lot of you. It's very interdisciplinary work that speaks to a lot of audiences. So I'll stop talking. Thank you all for being here. Without further ado, whenever you're ready, Adam.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of Penn State, and thanks to Daryl in particular. I think he set up a really amazing series. It's pretty wild. I've known Daryl for a super long time, since he was a grad student. Maybe I was a grad student too. I've visited him at every university he's been at, and I wish I could be with you in person at Penn State, but glad to be with you on Zoom. So I'm going to give, I think I'll talk for about, I was told 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'll also, pause to take some questions throughout, which I believe you can enter in the Q&A function. And when I'm looking to my right, that's because I'm on multiple screens, and that's where your questions show up. So to start, I'm going to give you a little glimpse into a terrible website, which is one that you're probably all familiar with, which is Twitter. And so Twitter, as many of you know, is a website where you can talk with people or argue with people. And occasionally, if you access Twitter on the web, on their kind of trending topics page, which describes what are people talking about at the moment on Twitter, it'll kind of give you, what's the story of the day, what's something interesting that happened. And several months ago, big conversation point was Elon Musk of SpaceX and Tesla, founder of SpaceX and Tesla, made some comment about saying that artificial intelligence is humanity's greatest threat. So this was a big, bold statement. And then a couple hours later, this was the big trending topic on Twitter, just below it. And I think this juxtaposition perfectly kind of encapsulates the confusion around how we're thinking about all of this new technology in our lives. Is this new technology an extreme threat? Is it extremely useless? Is it trivial? Is it just kind of a part of life? And that's where I, as a psychologist, try to come in and try to make sense of these things. And I've been working on this topic now for about 17 years. My grad school work started with a big concept related to this topic, looking at why do people humanize non-human things, including technology. And with Nick Epley and John Cacioppo, we wrote a big theory paper to explain why people anthropomorphize things in the world broadly, but a big focus of this is why people humanize non-human technology. And since that point in time, I've written a book that very much touches on this topic as well, kind of an encapsulation of a lot of this research. And what I'll point to today are kind of 4 sub areas where I've explored the psychology of automation. One, I have some work looking at what I refer to as everyday automation. So this is just kind of the automation in our pockets, the various gadgets and kind of things that we use to kind of get through everyday life. I also have some work on a specific form of automation that from time to time seems to be reasonably important, which is work on the autonomous car. I'll point to some work on what I call automation preferences, which is when people do or do not want technology to take on certain jobs. And I will probably spend the most time touching on some more recent work about kind of confronting automation as a force that really changes society with broad societal implications. And so when I started doing this work, this was kind of actually pre kind of smartphone area, but now this topic has become increasingly pressing and important. Mostly, if you look at kind of the headlines of what people are interested in terms of automation, it's are robots and other various forms of technology going to take our jobs? And here you can even see some scientists have come up with a way to quantify the amount, the likelihood that your job will be taken by a robot. So it seems that dentists have a very low likelihood of being automated, whereas telemarketers have a very high likelihood of being automated. And in all of these conversations about the increasing role that robots and technology will be playing in our lives, usually the technology people have a lot to say about this. The people actually developing robots and software, computer scientists, engineers, roboticists, and economists have a lot to say about this as well in terms of the implication of new technology for kind of wages and labor and things like that, and economic growth. And I find that the voice that's been missing is really that of people like myself, behavioral scientists and social psychologists in particular. This has changed a little bit in the past few years, but I feel like we are not really part of these conversations about the role of technology in society, but we have some reasonable things to say about this. One, I think social psychologists are useful in this domain because social psychologists deal with statistical interactions. So rather than just saying, is technology good or bad, we often speak to the question of under which conditions is technology good or bad. Two, given that our field was really rooted from its inception in this study of studying people's attitudes and preferences, we're reasonably good at answering the question, okay, regardless of technology's benefit for enhancing efficiency and making our lives easier, do people even want this stuff in their house? It's as though Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos just gave us all this stuff without asking us if we really want it. As social psychologists, we study social interactions. So what are the optimal conditions for humans to interact with other humans? Similarly, that would make us well suited to speak to how to optimize interaction and division of labor between humans and machines. And then as social psychologists and behavioral scientists, we are thinking about the social implications of things. So beyond kind of the implications of new technology for innovation and tech itself, and beyond the economic implications, how is this new technology going to affect how we think about each other? And again, this is some work that I'm going to try to draw out at the end. And I'll just give you a snapshot of the type of work I do on each of these topics, starting with this question of, can we speak to this issue that people want to know, is technology good or bad for us? And in particular, in line with this empathy seminar series, the question that I and my colleague Kurt Gray was interested in, is technology good or bad for empathy? Okay, because every other week you see all sorts of headlines about technology is depleting our empathy, or technology is enhancing our empathy. And so we really wanted to say, okay, you hear a lot about this question. Let's actually dive into the research and look at what does empirical research tell us about technology's effect on empathy. Does the use of online technology boost empathy or reduce empathy? And the answer we came to after looking at all the research is yes. Yes, with the caveat, it's too early to say, because in fact, despite all of the research on this question, this big question that people want to know about, there's surprisingly little research out there that has addressed this question empirically. And so how did we look at this question? Well, what we did is, to give you the punchline, we kind of found 3 different pathways by which online technology affects empathy. But to explain these 3 pathways, I'll explain to you how we even got to this point. Now, the first thing we noticed is, when you do a research project like this, you have to search for all the papers that on Google Scholar or whatever database you use that have some measure of online technology use and some measure of empathy. And when we restricted our search to empathy, there were very few papers that examined both of these constructs. So we actually had to broaden our search to look at any research that examines sociability. And what do we mean by sociability? Here we're looking at any paper that measures empathy, perspective taking, emotion recognition, and emotional intelligence. By emotion recognition, I mean people's ability to identify what are you feeling from your facial expression or from your voice. From by emotional intelligence, I mean, generally how good are you at reading other people's emotions and using emotional information. And so we broadened out to look at sociability using these 4 different search terms and constructs. And then by online technology use, we're looking at any research that measures the use of the internet, mobile apps, including texting, and we even expanded our search to include virtual reality. Virtual reality isn't the same as going online, but it's a type of technology that takes you outside of the here and now. So after we expanded our search terms, we still only came across 70 papers. And of 70 of these papers, really only half of them address this particular relationship. And so a lot of our paper on this was saying, okay, there's actually way more work that needs to be done on this topic. But of the 70 papers we looked at, we uncovered kind of 3 relationships between online technology use and sociability, inclusive of empathy. One, we found that using technology such as the internet or texting or Facebook or whatever the case may be, can actually boost empathy and boost sociability when you're using it to complement existing relationships you have with people that you communicate with in real life. Okay, so technology can be good for empathy when it's used in a complementary fashion. On the other hand, when you use it as a substitute for in real life interaction, it's going to deplete, it's going to reduce your empathy. It's going to create more superficial interactions, and you're not going to get the same degree of empathy. And then the third relationship we found is what we call kind of the better than nothing relationship, which is that for people who find it very difficult to interact with others socially, so these might be people with limited mobility, elderly individuals, or people who score high on the autism spectrum, who dislike in real life social interaction. When this kind of in real life social engagement is lacking or difficult to find, online interaction or using online technology can in fact boost empathy. It provides a better than nothing substitute. So this is kind of just a little snapshot into how two social psychologists, myself and Kirk Gray, address this issue of, well, is technology good or bad for us? You know, we start to get into, well, when is it good? When is it bad? And how? The second big area that we try to address in this kind of broad kind of psychology of technology domain is, do people like this stuff? Will people like this stuff? And one piece of technology that, you know, a lot of individuals want to know about is the autonomous car, the self-driving car that, you know, seems to have stalled in production, but every car company is producing some version of the autonomous car. It just so happened that General Motors contacted myself and Nick Epley and asked us if we want to study the autonomous car, because they're building their version of the autonomous car, General Motors, and they didn't know, are people going to like this? Are people going to trust this? And so they didn't actually give us a car, but they did give us a very fancy simulator, driving simulator, which was so, you know, realistic. The first time I used it, I was, you know, looking over my shoulder to kind of check my blind spots. And we set up a very simple study in a laboratory in downtown Chicago. We had people come into the lab and we assigned them to one of three conditions to measure how much did they like this experience, how much did they trust the car. One condition was actually a control condition where they drove the car normally. So they controlled steering, braking, you know, acceleration, and it feels very realistic. So they drove the car as they normally would through a course. And then we had two autonomous conditions. One condition we called our Agentic Condition, where people drove in the self-driving car, and there really isn't much for you to do as the driver. You don't control steering, speed control, braking, things like that. But you experience what it's like to be in a self-driving car because you feel the rumble of the road, you see cars passing you, or you pass cars and things like that. And then our third condition that people were assigned to was our anthropomorphic condition. And our anthropomorphic condition was an autonomous driving condition, but with a few human-like features added. We gave the car a name, Iris, a gender, female, and a voice, which you'll hear in a moment, a human-like voice. And we had them kind of drive through a normal course, and we just asked them a few basic questions. You know, they went from point A to point B in one of these three conditions. We asked them basic questions about how much do you trust the car? And we created a composite out of various items asking them, do you have confidence in the car? Are you willing to give up control to the car? Do you trust the car to get you to where you need to go? Do you feel safe in the car? We averaged these items into a self-report trust composite. Then we had them complete a second course where we measured what I'm going to call behavioral trust and blame for the car once it gets into an accident. So in the second course, unbeknownst to participants, what you'll see in a moment, we programmed the course such that they get into an accident that is not their fault. A car bangs into them, okay? And this accident was really unavoidable to the point that only one person in our normal driving condition was able to swerve out of the way. And how we measured behavioral trust, what I'm calling behavioral trust, although you could really think about it as comfort, is we measured how much their heart rate changed from baseline to the moment they get into the accident. So we have little skin conductance hooked up to the wrist that can measure kind of basic heart rate change, which is, you know, kind of a de facto measure of arousal. And we also videotaped their responses and scored them in terms of how startled did this person look. And I will show you all of this in a moment. But important thing to know is this heart rate change and startle response, these two things were highly correlated. So we took this as a measure of behavioral trust, or how comfortable do you feel in the car when you get into this accident. And then we ask them questions about how much do you blame the car, your car, and want to punish the car, as well as punish the engineer and the car company and things like that. That was our measure of how much responsibility or how much blame are you assigning to the car itself and its related entities. I'll take questions in just a moment on both of these first few things, but first let me show you, what does the collision look like? This is the collision in the anthropomorphic condition, and hopefully the video and the sound will work for you here.
I'm sorry, we've had an accident. Please pull over and put the car in park.
All right, so you get a sense of this anthropomorphic condition. It's kind of like a little bit of GPS. The car kind of narrates your drive. And so we're measuring at this point when the accident occurs and before the voice comes on, is there a heart rate increase? To what extent? And how startled are you? And we're measuring startle on a 1 to 3 scale, from 1, not at all startled, 2, moderately startled, 3, extremely startled. We had research assistants code responses, and this is what people actually looked like. So this is someone who would be coded as a 1, not at all startled.
I'm sorry.
Okay, so I can't see your guys' faces, but hopefully you were able to see that. This guy isn't phased at all, gets into the accident and, you know, no response. This would be someone who is scored as a 2.
I'm sorry.
All right, so there's a little bit of a jolt there. And then this is someone who would be scored as a 3. All right, so there you can see more startled. So again, this study has kind of 3 main measures. 1, self-report. How much do you trust the car in general? 2, what I'm calling behavioral trust, which is the reverse score of having high heart rate increase and high startle response, okay? I'm saying the reverse score of that because less startle, less heart rate response means you're more comfortable. You're less phased, you're less aroused, you have some comfort or trust with the car. And then the third component, which we asked after the accident, is essentially how much do you blame the car for the accident? And I'll show you this on all together. And so the y-axis here is standardized, which means these numbers aren't really meaningful. But what I want to show you here is on self-reported trust, you see this linear effect where people, you know, trusted the car the least in the normal condition, significantly more when the car was autonomous, and significantly more when the car was both autonomous and had these human-like features. In terms of behavioral trust, which is again, how comfortable are you after the accident, both in terms of kind of low arousal and low startle response, you see this actually means people are having the least startled response in the anthropomorphic condition, as though the presence of a voice and a name put people more at ease. And then the blame results, you know, we kind of had an open hypothesis here. We didn't know what exactly we would find. What we find here, I want to unpack. So what you see here is that people were blaming their own car for the accident the most in these autonomous conditions, which makes sense. Like if you're actually driving the car in the normal condition, you're not going to blame your car for getting into an accident. You know, there's going to be some blame for you, some blame for the other person. But what is more interesting is what happens in the 2 autonomous conditions. You indeed blame the car in the autonomous condition, but this blame is significantly attenuated in the anthropomorphic condition. And what we kind of think is happening here is essentially people are treating the car as an intelligent agent. And so just as you would kind of give the benefit of the doubt to a smart Uber driver, if they were, rammed into or rear-ended or something, people are giving the benefit of the doubt and they're blaming the car less when it has these human-like features. So I'll now pause to take some questions. I see one in the chat, and I'm kind of looking to my right here to see the question in the chat from Kristen. Did you pre-test the voice, female versus male? And B, how, if at all, do you believe empathy and sympathy relate in terms of your findings? So good question. So one, we did not counterbalance having a male or female voice. And in fact, our female voice is a fellow psychologist, organizational behavior person who some of you on the call might even know, just someone who happened to have a really good voice for this. And we use them conveniently. And then after the study, when they took away our simulator, we said, oh, we probably should have looked at whether there are different effects for a male voice. It might be the case that this woman's voice is very soothing or maternal. Maybe there's some stereotyping involved of females as being caring that might have played into this. So that's unfortunately just an open question. And then in terms of empathy and sympathy, well, what we also find is that people attribute more mental states to the car, the more human-like it is. So they attribute the fewest mental states, both thinking and feeling, to a normal car, like we would attribute to our own car, a little bit more to the agentic car, and the highest amount to the anthropomorphic car. And we also show that the extent to which we, this might not be what the question is, the extent to which we are seeing the car as having mental states, to the extent to which we're sort of empathizing with the car, we see that predicting how much we trust in the car as well. So hopefully that answered your question. Again, this whole experience is new to me, of not being able to see people's faces or hear them say their questions. So I'll do the best I can. Eliana asks, would it also make sense that the more agency one perceives, the more they blame, since the blame has more of a target? And yes, typically agency would translate into more blame. But what's interesting here is that even though here it's both enhanced agency and experience toward the car, it's really more of a different process. And Eliana, by the way, I think your question would be absolutely true, or your hypothesis would be true, if it was an accident where it was really our car's fault. This is an accident where it's the other person's fault, okay? And so in this case, where it's really not your fault, you're actually going to blame the car less, even though you're giving it more agency, because you're thinking about the car in terms of its intelligence. And well, my car was smart enough, it would have avoided this if it could. Lots of questions here, and so I might want to wait to the end. But Jesse asked a really important question: why is less startled equal to more trust in the car? Less startled, trust is kind of a big term. We're thinking about when you are less startled, that means you're more at ease with the car. You are more comfortable with the car. So that's, we also, the other reason why we feel somewhat confident in that conceptualization is that this measure of, what we're calling behavioral trust is correlated with self-reported trust.
Adam, sorry to interject quickly. Just as a FYI, there's the one raised hand I saw on the side from earlier by Paul. Sure. If folks who have questions about the Q&A, if you have a question you'd like Dr. Waytz to answer, go ahead and use the Q&A and just use that feature on the bottom of the webinar window. And we'll try to get to all questions as we can.
Yeah, I apologize. Paul Scarlott has had a hand up for a while that might have not made it into the Q&A chat. So if you want to type that question out, I'm happy to get to it. There's all these good questions. let me answer these, and then I'll kind of move on to the second part of my talk. How would blameworthiness toward the car shift if the driver was to blame for the accident? Would the anthropomorphic car receive greater blame? I believe that is very likely to be the case. So even though, and that's what you would expect kind of going into this whole ordeal studying autonomous cars. Well, we're giving them more agency in mind, therefore they should be judged as more responsible. And even in the case where it wasn't our car's fault, you're seeing that to be the case. They're being judged more responsible than in the normal driving condition. But what's interesting is that to the extent that people, kind of attribute mind and develop trust in this car through the addition of these small human-like features, that seems to attenuate blame. Pratima asks, were participants exposed to automated cars in the past? No, we looked at kind of various driving history questions, and that didn't seem to play a difference. Julian really latched onto something important, which was sort of inadvertent. When the car gets into an accident in the anthropomorphic condition, it says, I'm sorry, it seems we have gotten into an accident. And that might have played a role into our findings, at least in terms of the blame findings. Now we're measuring kind of startle response and heart rate before that, so it wouldn't affect those variables, but it certainly could mean that people are blaming the car less because it offered an apology. So, a cleaner version of the study would have, done this both with and without an apology. This might be kind of some inadvertent insight for car companies that if you want not to be blamed for your automated car getting into a crash, it should apologize. Maybe that's one insight here. And then Melody asked, were there age-related impacts? No, we had a pretty mixed sample of ages like 18 to 60s, I would say. I don't think we had anyone in their 70s, and age didn't contribute, but you could definitely imagine that playing a role. So again, here's a sense of kind of what I do broadly around these issues of psychology of automation. When is technology good or bad for us? Under what conditions are people going to like technology? And the reason why technology people are interested in the self-driving car is because they've kind of done the stats and they've said, look, this is going to reduce traffic accidents, reduce drunk driving, be better for the environment. And that doesn't really mean anything if people don't trust it to begin with, or they don't want the car to begin with. So our study sheds a little bit of light on features that may enhance trust. Now, briefly, I'll go over my kind of third topic of interest, which is division of labor. Under what conditions are people more comfortable with robots taking jobs or less comfortable with robots taking jobs? And here we had a very simple hypothesis based on other people's work, which is that to the extent that a job appears to require emotion and feeling and empathy and things like that, people will be more uncomfortable with robot outsourcing or bot sourcing or robot taking that job. To the extent that a job seems to require cognition or thinking or analytical thought, people will be more comfortable with a robot taking that job. Why is that the case? Because of a large existing research that basically shows people have stereotypes of robots, that people think of robots as thinking agents, but not feeling agents. They see robots as lacking in emotion, and they don't like robots to have emotion, but they're perfectly fine attributing cognition and thought to robots. And so we make this distinction between kind of cognitive domains, tasks that require a lot of thinking. People should be comfortable with robots taking those domains for work, but they should be relatively uncomfortable with robots taking over domains that they believe require emotion. And our first studies on this point were very rudimentary. We went to Amazon Mechanical Turk, which is an online marketplace where people do little tasks for psychologists or for marketing firms or for ad agencies. They'll rate images, or they'll participate in our studies, or they'll do proofreading. And the interesting thing about Mechanical Turk, which I think is actually usually not an ideal place to do studies these days, it's well suited for this type of work, because a lot of the work that people perform on Mechanical Turk or MTurk is work that is actually being taken over by robots, by bots that can do proofreading or evaluation, or sometimes bots, to our dismay, complete our studies. So we were able to ask MTurk workers in a very realistic way. We were able to tell them, as robots are replacing workers on MTurk for a lot of the tasks that you guys do. And these tasks are called HITs, or HITs, human intelligence tasks. We told them in study A, which is within subjects, as some of these HITs involve thinking, cognition, and analytical reasoning. This is where we're kind of trying to highlight the cognitive nature of work on MTurk. How comfortable are you with robots taking over these types of tasks? And I'll show you what our measures look like, where we ask them, how comfortable are you? Other HITs or other tasks involve emotion, feeling, emotion, and emotional evaluation. How comfortable are you with robots taking these tasks? And then we did pretty much just a basic replication, which is between subjects. So either you were told robots are taking your work in the cognitive domain, or robots are taking your work in the emotional domain. And we measured comfort in terms of these questions. On a 1 to 7 scale, how much would you agree with these statements? Outsourcing these tasks to robots concerns me, disturbs me a great deal, poses a threat to me, is unwise, will be effective, etc. And so we reverse score items where necessary, and again, just create a composite for how comfortable are you with robot outsourcing. And what we find is, across studies, even though the absolute levels of comfort differ, there's this consistent difference where people are more comfortable outsourcing tasks to robots when the tasks are cognitive in nature and involve thinking, versus when the tasks involve feeling and emotion. And we've also, looked into ways to mitigate this discomfort. You can frame any job as more cognition-based, and people will be more comfortable with robots doing the work, such as in the domain of surgery. Or when you introduce robots that appear capable of emotion, people are more comfortable with robots that look emotional doing emotional work. So even things like therapy or social work or teaching. Fred asks, why do you think there's a difference between the within and between subjects version? I think could be just total noise, could be the fact that when you're asking these questions in isolation, people are just less comfortable overall. But when you're having people compare, cognitive tasks versus emotional tasks, they'll say, well, I'm not crazy about robots taking my job, but I'd at least prefer robots taking my cognitive tasks versus my emotional work. Could be something like that. Good question. Now, finally, I know we're close to time here, but this is probably the work that's most recent and perhaps the work that I'm most excited in. It's work looking at the social implications of automation. What I mean by social implications is, yes, we know automation is moving into all sorts of spheres in our life, and we know that this has implications for the economy and for innovation and future tech development itself. But how does it affect how we think about each other? And in particular, my postdoc, Monica Gamaz-Jokic, and I wanted to know, does the rise of automation affect how we think about immigration? And you can imagine the answer could be, there's absolutely no relationship between these two things. One, you're thinking about robots. Two, you're thinking about immigrants. Why should my attitudes toward one affect the other? Or you could imagine that there's a relationship such that the more I'm concerned about automation as a threat to society, as a threat to my job, the less I'm concerned about immigrants, because I recognize that the real big effect on the economy is the rise of automation, And the real big effect on kind of societal change is the rise of technology. And so I understand that immigrants do not pose a threat in this way. The real kind of threat to my daily life is the rise of machines. We hypothesize something different, though, based on existing cross-sectional research, which is that we hypothesize the more you are concerned about automation, the more negative you should feel about immigration. And we came up with this hypothesis based on some work showing that, for example, so at the county level, counties that lost more jobs to robots between 2012 and 2016 actually shifted to becoming more inclined to vote for the what I would call the more anti-immigration candidate, which was Donald Trump in 2016. So, whatever you think about these two parties or two candidates, I think it's inarguable that Donald Trump was the more conservative candidate on immigration, and it just happens to be the case that accounting for a lot of things, areas that were more exposed to job loss due to robots became more pro-Trump. Interestingly, the exact same pattern you see in Sweden and a similar study across Western Europe, areas that lost more jobs to automation became more inclined to vote for the anti-immigrant parties in their country. In this case, it's always weird, but evidently any Swedes can correct me on this. The most right-leaning party in Sweden and the most restrictive party toward immigration is called the Democrats. But anyway, bottom line is areas more exposed to automation became more anti-immigration. So here I'll show you our research on this, and then we'll wrap it up. This is all cross-sectional. What we want to look at is, can we find existing nationally representative data where people are asked questions about how they feel about automation and how they feel about immigration? And we searched every kind of survey database we could find, and we found 7 nationally representative surveys that actually go back to 1986 or as recent as 2017. And these are all the nationally representative surveys that we could find that asked a question, any sort of question asking people's attitudes toward automation, and any sort of question in the same survey about immigration. And these questions were all over the map, but we were able to compute a correlation in each one. All of these surveys are from the US, except this big one with almost 28,000 people was the Eurobarometer, which taps into participants across Europe. And I'll just show you our regression table and to go through this quickly. What this basically shows, the standardized beta, is in every one of our surveys, there is a positive significant correlation between concerns about automation are linked to concerns about immigration. And of course, we want to control for every factor under the sun: political leaning, age, gender, are you employed, are you unemployed, what's your job, race, anything we could think of, we try to control for in terms of demographics and ideology. And in 5 out of the 7 cases, the finding remains significant. Okay, so this isn't totally driven by other factors. And then we also wanted to control for questions about other employment threats. Okay, we wanted to say this isn't just like people are generally worried about employment, and so they latch on to concerns about 2 things that are supposedly going to affect employment: immigration and automation. So in at least, 6 of the surveys, there were other items just asking people more general questions about concerns about employment. And in 5 out of the 6 cases, the results held when controlling for kind of general employment concerns. Then, of course, what we wanted to do is conduct our own studies, get out of these nationally representative surveys. We did one study with working adults in Chicago, one study online with working adults in the UK, and then one study with working adults in the US. And I'll kind of just like zip through what these surveys look like. They all have three features. One, questions about how concerned are you about automation? In our third study I just told you, we actually disentangle how much are you concerned about automation taking your job in particular versus just concerned about automation generally. Then we ask questions about threat, both realistic threat toward immigrants and symbolic threat toward immigrants. So are you concerned that immigrants, are going to hurt the economy? That's what's meant by realistic threat. And just in generally, are you concerned that immigrants are going to undermine culture, society, values, things like that? And then we ask questions about support for restrictive immigration policies. And I'm just going to zip through our findings because they're the same in every study. In every case, automation concerns, and this is all correlational, but concerns about automation make you more inclined to believe that immigrants both pose a real economic threat as well as a symbolic threat to culture, which also contribute to you endorsing more restrictive positions on immigration in terms of policy. We also ask other questions about policy on items unrelated to immigration. So it's not just like people become more conservative, it's specific to immigration policy. See the exact same thing in study 2B, exact same thing in study 2C. And to get into the weeds of this, I know this just looks like a bunch of lines and numbers to people, but our initial thinking was that people think of automation as a job killer, and so they're going to offload that anxiety onto immigrants, which are also, often portrayed as taking jobs, even though I don't think that is in fact true. And in fact, it was not. If anything, we would see that. If we were seeing that happening, we would see that through this realistic threat pathway. But if anything, the bigger effect was on symbolic threat, that automation represents kind of a change to our culture and our values, and people are kind of offloading that anxiety onto immigrants instead. Just to wrap up here, I've only shown you correlational results so far. So to show you some causality, we conducted a study where either in a control condition, we just kind of tell you, hey, jobs are at risk in these various industries, give people general information about job loss, or we have two conditions where we tell people automation is a threat to jobs. And also, based on the occupation you entered at the beginning of the study, we can compute how much at risk your job is to being taken by a robot. And so, and then we ask people our items about immigration. So the control condition just says, here are some industries that we expect to experience employment declines. Or in our automation salience conditions, we say, new research finds that about half of US employment is at risk of being automated. Based on the information you entered, you have a very low personal chance of being automated yourself or a high chance. And then we look at support for restrictive immigration policy. This was not necessarily what we predicted, but what we found was that both automation conditions, whether you're told you personally are at risk or at low risk of having your job automated, both of these automation exposure conditions increased support for more restrictive immigration policies compared to our control condition. And both of these conditions seem to increase the perception of threat, that immigrants are a threat, both realistic and symbolic threat. So again, it's not that people are personally concerned per se with robots taking their jobs. It's that in general, being exposed to the idea of automation is concerning. It's concerning kind of at a basic values cultural level. And people seem to be offloading those perceptions of threat onto immigrants. And so final study, again, in the interest of time, I'll just say very quickly, here was a study where we moved it outside of the self. We told people about an organization that needs to cut jobs. We told them in one condition, they need to cut jobs because they're adopting new technology that will automate human jobs, or in a basic control condition, we said, they're cutting jobs because they're restructuring and downsizing certain departments. And then we gave people different worker types, male and female workers, older and younger workers, high educated, low educated workers, immigrant and non-immigrant workers, and said, what percentage of each of these groups do you think should be laid off in this organization? And the only category where we found a significant difference was on immigrant workers, such that those in the automation condition were more willing to lay off immigrant workers than those in the restructuring condition. Non-significant differences for male, female workers, older, younger workers, high versus less educated workers. So to sum up here, here's where we start to get at kind of the societal effects of automation. It's an open question as to whether these attitudes are bidirectional. We think we're starting to stumble upon what's the broader mechanism at play here. Well, advanced technology, it's not just seen as an economic threat, but it represents kind of a fundamental change to our values. And so people might be concerned about kind of any change to our home culture, whatever that might be in their minds. For now, we have evidence over like big samples and representative data, and going back to 1986, that this relationship is robust between concerns about automation and immigration, which is a bit depressing because that seems to be based on some erroneous beliefs. So, future directions, I'm kind of all over the map here, in terms of this psychology of technology domain. We're doing all sorts of work, but in the interest of time, I'd love to take your questions, and thank you, and thank all of my collaborators. So thanks so much. And yeah, we'll answer some questions now. So Daryl, do you want me to just read the questions in the Q&A?
Yeah, so I mean, anybody, we have people here from Penn State, but also all around the country. So thanks for attending Adam's talk. And, if you have any questions, please do feel free to ask any that you have in the side chat here, or the Q&A. And yeah, we'll try to field them as they come in order of those received. So any and all questions, welcome.
So Julian asks, about the way shifts to automation are attributed, who's to blame when considering job loss? Right. So I don't know. I assume, can everyone see the questions, or should I read them out loud?
Oh yeah. So I guess two quick things. If you wouldn't mind stopping the screen share, and then, unless there's a question about something in particular with the slides. But yeah, it might be helpful. Others can't see the questions, so it might be helpful to briefly recap the content.
Okay, so this is a very nice, weighty question from Jillian. All right, have you considered studying the way shifts to automation are attributed? Who is to blame when considering job loss, or where people attribute maybe outrage for job losses? I realize those higher up in companies may be the determinants of whether jobs are lost due to automation increases. And it's interesting to consider people thinking stricter immigration policy is the way to alleviate their concerns. Also seeing ties to Maureen Craig's work on majority groups threatened with loss of majority status and conservatism, but you noted you didn't find that in your studies. Okay, great. So I'm not sure if I'm going to answer going to get the question right, but so Maureen Craig's work, if I'm remembering it, because we did draw on her work, shows that when people are exposed, when white people are exposed to the idea that we are becoming a majority minority country, that is by the year whatever, a majority or plurality of people will be non-white in the US, they actually become more conservative in their attitudes because this is a threat to their status. And I think that is part of the story. We had to rule out that people, exposure to automation just makes people more conservative. So like I said, we had all sorts of other policy questions in there, questions about the environment, abortion, taxes, things like that. And there was no consistent conservative shift. It was strictly on this question of immigration. But I do think, yeah, automation does represent sort of a status threat. Like it makes you feel bad. Actually, some people have done work about, does it feel worse to lose your job to a machine versus another human? And it kind of varies. It kind of varies. Like, this is kind of Daryl's domain, but if I'm recalling this correctly, there's different emotional responses. So I think it's something like you feel sad to lose your job to a machine, but you feel mad to lose your job to a human. I'm probably not getting that right, but you can see there's a lot of complexity to this. And I think part of the effect of losing your job to a machine, or the fact that machines are kind of taking over, there is a sadness, and it also makes you feel maybe like less worthy as a human being or something like that. And that type of status threat might trigger people to transfer that anger toward an out group. There might be some of that going on. We weren't measuring that per se, but that could be part of the mechanism as well. So I'm kind of centering on the last part of your question. And I'll stop there just to, because I think that's my clearest thought on the question. All right, so Fred S, trying to tie together the last set of studies with the earlier ones. Do you think people would be less threatened by automation if the automation was anthropomorphized? I think it's a great question. It's something we've thought about, and I could see it going in kind of two directions. So one, if you see the technology as more human-like, you might be more forgiving of the technology that's taking your job, because you see it as intelligent, and okay, that's the ball game. Like, I was just replaced by someone who is smarter than me or as smart as me. And so there might not be this anxiety that gets transferred onto an outgroup. But on the other hand, if you're seeing an anthropomorphic robot taking your job, that could be, that could really be threatening. It could, what we didn't ask is, there's another source of people's outrage that actually, this might tie into the previous question as well, Julian's question, that we never measured, which is like, what if we ask people how upset they are at the bosses, okay? Or at the people in power? Like, we're only giving them we're only asking them questions about immigrants and immigration. So that's the target here. But if we gave them someone else to be upset about, might they be upset at the CEOs, the bosses, the people who are actually automating them out of a job? And you could see, if the technology replacing them was anthropomorphic, you might say, like, you've probably seen a lot of these kind of like automated stations at fast food restaurants or something. Like, if that was my job, I might be really upset about that. And that could be another way that blame gets displaced. Cool. All right. So Jesse's here, one of my colleagues on the other side of the country, so this is a really cool feature of this, that I can connect with old friends while I'm talking. Would your cognition emotion studies predict that people should always react negatively to automated agents acting emotionally, such as Alexa and Iris saying, "I'm sorry," or do we just fall into conversational habits with them? Do people increasingly use automated agents to do the emotional work of reducing loneliness? So this is a really good question, because Kurt Gray and Dan Wegner had this paper in Cognition that showed that people are really just kind of, in general, averse to emotional robots. That robots that look like that have like a human-like face that makes them seem capable of emotion, that's just uncomfortable. And we know from some studies on the Uncanny Valley that to be the case. But it turns out, so like, that's a pretty blunt force study, where if you show people a robot that looks emotional, people just don't like it. But what our studies show, and I didn't present these studies, is something slightly different. That like, if you have to have a robot perform a job that requires emotion, like a caretaker, a therapist, a preschool teacher, a social worker, then people actually prefer a robot that is capable of emotion. So to your question, I think when the robot is good enough at expressing emotion, then we do fall into that kind of automated pattern where we connect with it like we would another human being. And in fact, a woman named Gail Lucas has done some studies showing that robotic therapy actually, for a lot of people, having basically a robot conduct a therapy session allows people to disclose more, because they actually get very comfortable with the robot so long as the robot seems to be capable of emotional intelligence. There's also one other caveat to all of this, which is I think when a robot looks too human, we just don't like it in general. And so what Alexa and our car study have kind of stumbled upon is, I think, this sweet spot of using voice, but not a face. When it's a human-like voice, I think people are really comfortable with that, but they don't like the presence of a human-like face per se.
And piggybacking.
Yeah, go for it.
I'm sorry, I thought you were.
No, go for it.
There have been some discussions locally with other people we brought in about the role of robots in like caregiving settings.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious if it seems like your work directly speaks to this question of, what is the role of authenticity in human technology interaction if, for example, an elderly individual is relying on a care bot for this sort of emotional support and it makes them feel better, is the fact that perhaps the robot doesn't have sentient experience, does it diminish the authenticity of the interaction in a way that it reduces the well-being of the person being provided for? So I'm just curious, this brings back some of the stuff we were talking about in the meet and greet earlier.
Yeah, this is like the big question, because with the booming elderly population, there's this massive interest in care robots. And what I mentioned when we were chatting earlier is I've finally gotten the opportunity to hopefully study this a little bit with Sony, who has developed this robotic pet named Aibo. It's a robotic dog. And the idea is you could, give this to elderly people, and this would provide a source of companionship and connection. So we're about to actually do those studies, which I'm excited about. Prior to this, I've only written about this and speculated. And my speculation is that something like Aibo, a robotic pet, or there's this robotic seal called Paro, which is a Japanese robot. I think those are kind of going to be the optimal robots for care and companionship, because they're pets and not humans. I think if you made the robot look too human, initially going into this, I would have thought, well, to maximize connection, you want the robot to be as human-like as possible. But in the context of, say, elder care, what you really want is to make sure that these people still feel like they have some agency over the situation. And the nice thing about these robotic pets is you can take care of them. So they provide companionship to you, but they still allow you to be the adult in the room, like the agent. And so I think that's kind of, we'll see when we actually study this, but there's already, a few research programs out there that have studied these care robots, and they seem to find some really positive effects for these robotic pets. The other part of this is that ultimately, you're going to need human caregivers as well. So it's not going to be like a robots replacing care work, but more of like a side-by-side type of thing. Great. So a few more questions. Crystal, do you think that automation threat and anti-immigrant attitudes can be related to ascribing less mental states to immigrants? That there is an overlap between one's mental representation of immigrants as mechanistically dehumanized and readiness to associate or conflate threats of automation with immigrants? It's really fascinating. That was like, I really wanted to, I don't think this is interesting to you, but I'll say it anyway. I've always studied, since like 2004, automation, how people think about machines, and dehumanization. That's been another part of my research program. And oftentimes we see dehumanization in an intergroup context where people dehumanize members of the outgroup. And I always wanted to put these two things together. And this is the closest that I got to it. So like, I would hope that something that you're talking about is at play. It's a little bit hard to figure out though, like, could it be possible that by seeing automation as intelligent, like seeing technology as having mental states, might that then lead you to see outgroup members as, by contrast, lacking in mental states, which might kind of facilitate the kind of outgroup antipathy that we see potentially? I'll have to think about that some more. Bing GS, I'm wondering to what extent the public attitude to automation interacts with the mainstream ideology of the society. It seems that the previous surveys being analyzed here were all done in a capitalist society and in the Judeo-Christian cultures. I'm wondering, were the studies done in a socialist country where automation taking jobs may be considered as a bonus for the entire society, or a less anthropocentric society, the results would be different? So it's a great question. And I imagine you're really going to get cultural effects also in terms of like, how open is your country to immigrants in general? Interestingly, the cross-sectional results that I showed you from Sweden, which I guess I would consider a socialist country, at least in Sweden, these economists have demonstrated that areas that lost jobs to automation became more aligned with the far right party, the anti-immigration party. But there's got to be a ton of third variables there. Like, that can't be the whole story. So might it be the case in a society where automation is considered a bonus, maybe our effect would dampen, or in countries where immigration is seen as a bonus, might the effect dampen? The closest I could speak to that would be to tell you, the result is pretty much the same between Democrats and Republicans, where Democrats are the people who typically think about immigrants as a net positive. So it might not be the whole story, but I love the idea of doing that cross-cultural comparison. Rose, what motivations drive people to anthropomorphize their cars, and is that process mindful? Can we, the tech designer, activate those motivations to reduce automation concerns, and how? So the very first paper that we ever wrote on this whole topic was looking at why are people motivated to anthropomorphize, and there's a cognitive explanation as well, but the two major motivational sources are when people are in need of social connection, they're more inclined to anthropomorphize, and when people are in need of understanding whatever they're dealing with. So when we had these studies showing that when people's cars break down or when people have problems with their cars, they're more likely to anthropomorphize the car because they seek to have some sort of understanding over the car. Treating the car as human-like gives them at least the illusion that they understand it better. And so you could also indeed ramp up these motivations and get people to anthropomorphize their car more. And maybe by giving the car these human-like features, we made the car seem more like a source of social connection. Okay, Eliana, going off this data, ethically speaking, and as an immigrant, should we even be talking about automation if it leads to these anti-immigration attitudes? I realize it's somewhat of a moot point, but how do we even begin having these conversations about automation when vulnerable groups get targeted? I think that's an excellent question, even beyond the effect of immigration. Like, if we know, if our findings are robust, it's pretty disturbing, because it suggests that there's this major negative consequence to automation, which is that it makes people turn against immigrants. And so that kind of gets back to, why I think it's useful to have psychologists, philosophers, sociologists in these discussions, because a lot of the conversations around technology is it an improvement? Is it innovative? Does it help us out? If so, innovation equals good. But what you're pointing to, Eliana, is, well, if there are these negative downstream effects, we already talk about like negative effects of technology on privacy or radicalization or all sorts of things. And so even if these new technologies make our lives better in terms of, okay, now I don't have to ask Daryl for directions, I can just look it up on my phone, what's the cost? Is there an ethical cost? And so I think it's a great question. Hopefully, it's people are comfortable with me presenting these results. I mean, I think, it's at least good to know about them. That's my response to that. Pratima asks, do you think people's attitude toward immigration and automation might change if they were made aware of the pros and cons? Also, if people are made aware of the behind the screen events of automation, like Tesla laborers worked overtime and many ended up having cumulative trauma disorders following the release of automated cars. Will that decrease their trust toward automation or bias their feelings? Another just absolutely great question. Like if you actually explain to people that immigration is a net benefit for the economy. So again, a lot of the concerns that people have are not based on the idea of immigrants as a job killer, but that's part of the story. And so if you told people the truth that countries with high levels of immigration show more innovation, show more economic growth, could you dampen the effect? I think absolutely. Similarly, what if you told people the truth about automation? Now, we give people some information about automation in our studies, but the truth of the matter is that robots are really not taking our jobs anytime soon. Probably the worst thing that robots are doing is that they're not taking away work, they're making work more fragile. They're making it's creating kind of Uber for everything. It's creating more contract work without benefits and without labor protections and things like that. And so if you told people the truth about automation and immigration, I think this effect wouldn't be so robust, but we're kind of playing off people's stereotypes of what automation does and what immigration means. Alyssa, developmentally speaking, do you think it is healthy to feel empathy for robots and machines? Based on our other research on what does the use of technology do to empathy, I would say it's probably not healthy to the extent that it kind of crowds out people's kids' connections with real human beings. If kids have connections with human beings in real life, and then they communicate with them through technology, that can be a good thing. I mean, probably a lot of you experienced that during the pandemic. Like, we have kids communicating with grandparents over FaceTime, and they become more attached to the iPad because of that, but they're still getting the interaction with these people who are real individuals in their daily lives. So that's a good thing, but I think what you're talking about, Alyssa, is probably not healthy to really develop an attachment with machines at the expense of humans. Eileen asks, do you have any data on the kind of threat automation poses? For example, are people more afraid for their existence, a fear that could be solved with unconditional basic income, or are they more afraid of a loss of purpose? I'm blanking, I don't have any research on this, and I'm blanking on the people who did this work, but there is a paper in the journal Nature Human Behavior that speak to this is the work that looks at how do people respond to losing their job to a human versus a machine. From what I am, the data that we do have though really speaks to the latter point. Actually, it speaks more to the point that they're worried that automation just represents a change to our way of life, a change to our culture, less a threat to their like paycheck. It's really more of a threat to society broadly and to the values that we hold. That's why in that study, I know I was going through these quickly, we don't see any difference between the people who are told you have a 4% chance of losing your job to a robot versus people who are told you have an 85% chance of losing your job to a robot. So it's not so much the personal threat of automation, it's just the idea that automation is here that seems to threaten people. And then Julian asks, have you studied variations in automation taking out jobs in more communal versus agentic fields and how that might relate to your outcomes? I do wonder about how occupation differentiation might influence this too. I guess I don't have a clear delineation of these, maybe more caregiver versus leader roles, but I don't want to misrepresent these occupations as I present them too. Thanks. So this is a great question because this could enable me to kind of combine the work on which domains are people comfortable outsourcing robots to and the work on automation and immigration. And the first way that I can answer this question is to say, one, in the nationally representative surveys or in our own surveys, we don't see people differentiate, like showing different results by what type of job they have. But I think you're right that, if we're thinking about automation as taking like a caregiver role, then people should be less threatened overall. And there's less kind of threat that would then get transferred onto immigrants as well. So that's a nice way that we can moderate these effects. Great question.
So Adam, you've successfully handled 23 questions, which is the most questions I think I've seen in one of the Zoom webinars we've hosted here. If anybody has any additional thoughts, questions, there is time for a few more. I guess, one question I would have, I was really intrigued by the stuff you presented in the beginning about the different ways in which empathy and social media and just technology interaction can be construed. I mean, it seems like people often do seem to have this default that empathy online is sort of seen as an inherent negative, but it always, at least from my perspective, and it seems like your work with Kurt Gray is helping to expand this. It really depends upon how empathy is used in this context. And I sort of wonder, oh, because my daughter.